I have not knelt since Vorinvast. That is what I told myself, standing in the doorway of the wolf den on the third morning of the blizzard, looking at the healer unconscious on the stone floor with my 3 worst-injured wolves pressed against her like a living blanket. I had not knelt at the funerals. I had not knelt at the memorial rites when the council carved the names into the wall of the great hall. I had not knelt for 7 years because kneeling required something of the chest, a softening, a surrender, and I had nothing left in my chest to give. The healer's name was Myra Vane. I had not known it for the first 2 days. That is how little I had paid attention. She had arrived on the first night of the storm, alone except for a mule and a canvas pack that turned out to contain more medical supplies than I had seen assembled outside of a royal infirmary. My gate guard had brought her to me because there was protocol. Strangers seeking shelter in a crown outpost required the alpha's permission, and I was still, technically, an alpha. I had looked at her standing there in the entrance hall with snow in her hair and mud on her boots and a completely unafraid expression, and I had said, "Find her a room in the south wing, away from the wolves. She is not to interfere with the pack." She had nodded, picked up her pack and followed the guard. That should have been the end of it. My wolf had watched her walk away down the corridor. I had told my wolf to stop. This is the thing people do not understand about grief when it runs as deep and as long as mine had. It does not hurt after a certain point. It goes quiet. The wolf in the chest goes quiet. The instincts that were meant to keep a man reaching for a mate, for a bond, for the warmth of a body beside him in the cold, they don't die exactly. They go underground. They wait in the dark like a coal banked against the wind, and you learn to live without the heat because you have forgotten what you were supposed to be doing with it. Vorinvast was the eastern hold of my kingdom, a settlement of 400 souls, 23 bonded pairs, and 61 pack wolves. I was 31 when it fell. An ice break in the mountain pass, a rockslide that followed, a fire in the settlement when the heating oil store ignited from the sparks. I was 3 days hard ride away at the capital when the messenger reached me. By the time I arrived, there was nothing to do but count. I do not talk about what I counted. I counted once, and then I locked it, and then I built the administrative machinery of a functional kingdom over the top of it, and I kept going. That is what you do when you are an alpha king, and a third of your territory's eastern population has died in a single night. You keep going. You keep the courts running and the borders safe and the treaties current and the pack fed. You do not stop to feel it because there is no safe time to stop. My wolf had stopped for me. That was the part I couldn't explain to anyone who asked. The wolf in the chest, the instinct, the bond sense, the thing that was supposed to sing when a true mate was near, had simply gone still sometime in the months after Vorinvast and not woken since. My court healers had no name for it. The archive scholars called it dormancy, said it happened to alphas after catastrophic pack loss, said it generally resolved in 2 to 5 years. It had been 7. I ran my kingdom. I fed my wolves. I was a capable cold king in a capable cold kingdom, and I had stopped expecting anything different. The second day of the blizzard, I held court from the outpost's small receiving hall. There were always boundary matters, supply disputes, the paperwork of a functioning state, and I did not think about the healer in the south wing once until my steward mentioned, toward evening, that she hadn't appeared for meals. I told him to check on her. He came back 20 minutes later with a carefully neutral expression and told me she was in the wolf den. I told him to remove her. He went back and came back again and said that Frost wouldn't let him near. Frost was my oldest injury case. A white-tan-gray male with a shattered hind leg that had been set wrong by a traveling bone man 6 months ago, and then re-broken in an altercation at the eastern pen, and then infected, and who had not permitted anyone except myself and one specific pack hand to approach him since. He had bitten 2 guards and screamed at a healer from the capital city in a manner that had sent the man running. He was, apparently, lying with his head in the woman's lap. I told my steward I would deal with it myself after court. I then handled 3 more boundary matters and forgot about it again. I do not think this reflects well on me. I can only say that the administrative machinery of a large territory during a blizzard requires a great deal of attention, and that I had developed, over 7 years, a near-perfect ability to manage my attention and exclude anything that did not require immediate resolution. My wolf had not been quiet that evening. That was the thing I noticed later, lying in my room listening to the wind off the high pass, that the usual stillness in my chest had developed a low kind of hum, like a string just slightly vibrated, nothing loud enough to name, but there. I told myself it was the storm. I told myself it was Frost's injury improving, the pack sense picking up on it. I went to sleep. On the morning of the second day, I went to the wolf den intending to speak to her. She wasn't there. Frost was there, lying on his side in the deep straw, and he was asleep in a manner he had not been asleep since before his leg was broken, deeply, softly, with his big chest rising and falling without labor. The injury pen held 4 other wolves at various stages of recovery. Ash, a young female with a bite wound across the shoulder. Kern, a 3-year-old male with a cracked rib from a territorial dispute, and 2 others, Red and Salt, who were both dealing with the particular kind of joint inflammation that comes from wet winters and advancing age. All 4 of them were awake but quiet. Red had his chin resting on the pen rail, with the particular loose contentment of a wolf, whose pain has been recently and skillfully managed. On the floor of the pen, laid out with an exactness that suggested deliberate organization rather than accidental arrangement, were 3 small bundles of dried plant matter. I recognized one as fennel root, one I did not know, and one that smelled faintly of pine resin, a mortar and 2 clay dishes, and a set of linen bandages wrapped back precisely the way medical supply lines do it, not the casual fold of someone who'd used them in a hurry. She had been here, she had worked, she had put everything back. I stood in the pen doorway for longer than I should have, looking at 5 injured wolves who were all, to varying degrees, more comfortable than they had been the day before. The hum in my chest was a little louder. I found her at the water pump in the back passage, washing her hands with the focused efficiency of someone who has done a great deal of washing up and has no patience for the parts of it that don't matter. She was not tall. She wore a practical gray wool dress under a work coat that had seen considerable use, and her hair was up in the functional way of women who work with their hands, out of the way, not ornamental, held with a single pin that looked like it had been bent back into service from some earlier life as something else. She did not look up when I approached. "My lord," she said, which was technically appropriate, and which she said with the exact quantity of ceremony required and no more. "You were told to stay out of the wolf den," I said. She considered this. She dried her hands. "The bone man who set Frost's leg the first time did it at the wrong angle," she said. "It was causing referred pain up into his hip. He's been lying on it wrong because of it, which is making the shoulder and the ribs on the left side bear too much. That's probably why Ash got bitten. She was catching overflow hostility from the hip pain. I reset the scar tissue as much as I could without surgery and applied a drawing compound. He'll need rest and a different bedding arrangement. I've left the instructions with the straw." I looked at her. She looked back at me with the expression of a woman waiting to find out if she is going to be in trouble, and also clearly calculating, with some precision, whether the trouble will have been worth it. "The other 4, I said. "Red and Salt need warmth more than treatment. Their inflammation is winter onset and it'll ease in spring. I've given them a compound that should take the edge off. Kern's rib is knitting straight, he just needs another month off the active circuit. Ash's bite wound was starting to show early infection signs. I cleaned it out and rebandaged it." She paused. "None of it was difficult. Someone should have caught most of it before now." I had no good answer for that. My pack healer had been one of the 43 names on the Vorinvast wall. I had replaced him 3 times since. The current one was competent and frightened of large injured wolves and had developed, I suspected, the habit of assessing from outside the pen rather than going in. "You weren't summoned," I said. "No," she agreed. "I wasn't. I was also the only person in this outpost last night with the training to do anything useful, and your wolves were suffering. I thought you'd rather they didn't." She said it without aggression. She said it like a fact, which it was. I looked at her for a long moment. My wolf was doing something in my chest that I had no category for, not quite the hum of the past 2 days, but not yet anything I could name. A pull, maybe. A pressure behind the ribs. "Stay out of the den," I said, "unless you have my steward's permission." "Yes, my lord," she said, with the same quantity of ceremony as before. I went back to the receiving hall and held court for 4 hours and thought about her, on and off, in the intervals between disputes, not with intention. My mind simply kept returning to her the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth, not to examine it, just to know it's there. The 3rd day, I gave her permission. I didn't announce it with any particular formality. I told my steward that the healer in the south wing was to be allowed access to the wolf den at her discretion, and that she was to be given whatever supplies she requested from the infirmary stock, and he could put it on the outpost's quarterly accounts under specialist consultation. My steward wrote this down with his customarily neutral expression and relayed it without comment. I did not see her that day. I was in the east wing for most of it, working through the winter accounts and a difficulty with a grazing rights dispute that had been escalating for 3 months. In the evening I went to the main hall for the communal meal habit, not hunger, and she was there, at the far end of the lower table, eating with the same practical efficiency she seemed to bring to everything, talking in a low voice to one of the outpost's elderly packmates about something that made the old woman laugh. A real laugh, the kind that uses the whole face. I cannot explain exactly what happened in my chest at that moment. It was brief. A kind of brightness there and gone, like a coal catching and then going down again before I could look at it. I ate my meal and went to my room. At some point past midnight I woke with the clear, sourceless knowledge that something was wrong. This is one of the things that does not leave you, even when everything else goes quiet. The alpha sense that means something in your pack requires attention. It doesn't arrive as a thought. It arrives as wakefulness, sudden and total, sitting up in bed with no memory of deciding to. I was dressed and in the corridor before I understood what I was doing. My feet took me to the wolf den. She was on the floor. She had collapsed, was my first reading of it, and I crossed the pen in 4 steps and knelt before I knew I had decided to kneel. And then I understood, as I got close enough, that she hadn't collapsed in the way of someone hurt. She had simply worked past the point where her body would hold upright, and she had sat down against Frost's side to rest for a moment, and sleep had taken her before she could get up again. She was breathing evenly. Her color was right. One hand was still resting on Frost's left haunch, fingers loose, the thumb just grazing the place where the scar tissue was thickest. Frost raised his head when I came close, not in warning, in acknowledgement. Then he put his head back down. The other 4 were pressed against her in varying configurations. Ash had tucked herself against the healer's back, her injured shoulder somehow out and resting easy. Kern was across her feet. Red and Salt were close enough to lend warmth, their old joints apparently comfortable enough for that level of movement. 5 injured wolves, all resting, all choosing her over the good straw at the other end of the pen. My wolf woke up. I do not mean this as a figure of speech. I mean that the thing in my chest that had gone underground at Vorinvast and stayed underground for 7 years, the instinct, the bond sense, the weight of pack recognition and mate recognition folded into one, it came up like a man breaking the surface of black water. Sudden, complete, gasping. I sat back on my heels and could not move. The mark on my wrist, which had been cool and faint since Vorinvast, the alpha's bond mark, the one that was supposed to warm when a true mate was near, ran hot. Not gradually, all at once. A heat I had forgotten I was capable of feeling, starting at the wrist and moving up the arm, and my wolf was not quiet. It was not still. It was present in a way it had not been for 7 years, and it was absolutely certain about what it was telling me. I looked at her. She was asleep with my wolves around her like she belonged there, like she had always belonged there. I thought about the compound she'd left in the straw, the instructions written out for the pack hand in a clear, patient hand, Ash's shoulder, resting easy, Frost sleeping deeply for the first time in months. I thought about her at the water pump, not defensive, not performing, just telling me the truth about the bone man's mistake with the directness of a woman who assumed the truth was what was wanted. I thought about how my steward had told me this morning, while relaying the grazing dispute, that she had turned down the good room in the south wing, and asked instead for the small one that was closer to the wolf den, and had been apologetic about it, as though she expected to be refused, as though she had understood that requesting a convenience would be the kind of thing that required some grace. She had come here in a blizzard with no invitation, tended 6 animals that no one had asked her to tend, asked nothing of anyone except a small room closer to her patients, and had, at some point in the 3rd night, simply fallen asleep doing the work because she had not thought to stop before her body stopped her. My wolf was absolutely certain. I was beginning to agree with my wolf. I did not wake her. This is important to me. I thought about it for a long time, kneeling there on the stone floor of the wolf den with 5 wolves and 1 unconscious healer, and a wrist that was warm for the first time in 7 years, and I made a deliberate decision. She would not wake to a king kneeling over her in the dark, demanding to know if she felt it too. She would wake in warmth and safety, and she would eat something, and she would be fully conscious and in possession of herself before I said a word. I sent for blankets instead, a good one and a thick one. I laid them over her as carefully as I could without disturbing Ash's head on her shoulder. I sent for a brazier to be set outside the pen. I told my steward, who materialized at the den doorway with the impeccable timing of a man who had been watching this situation develop with professional interest, that the healer was to sleep as long as she needed and was to be brought a hot meal when she woke, in the den if that was where she still was. My steward's neutral expression contained multitudes. "My lord," he said, which conveyed precisely nothing and also conveyed everything. I went back to my room. I did not sleep. I sat in the chair by the window and watched the blizzard and felt the warmth in my wrist and tried to understand what I was going to do with a thing I had stopped believing was going to happen. She came to me in the mid-morning. She was clean and fed and entirely composed, and she had changed into a slightly better dress than the work one, which I suspected was the closest she came to ceremony. She had knocked on the door of the receiving hall, been let in by the guard, and now stood in the middle of the room with her hands laced together in front of her, and the look of a woman who has spent the last hour deciding what she is and is not going to say. "My lord," she said, "I understand I fell asleep in your wolf den." "You did," I said. "I apologize for the impropriety. I'll move to the south wing room if—" "I'd like you to stay in the room near the den," I said. She stopped. She looked at me, then she looked at my wrist where the mark was. It was not glowing. Bond marks don't glow, whatever the old stories claim. But it was a different shade than it had been for 7 years, warmer, more present. And she was a healer who dealt in bodies and signs, and she understood what she was seeing. She was quiet for a long time. "I don't feel it yet," she said. She said it carefully, honestly, without apology. I don't know if I'm the kind of person who will. I came here because of the storm, not because of anything I wasn't looking for." She stopped herself, tried again. "I want to be honest with you." "Good," I said, "so do I." She waited. My wolf has been dormant since Vorinvast, I said. 7 years. I had stopped expecting it to wake. I had stopped expecting most things, if I'm telling you the truth. I looked at her across the receiving room, this small practical woman who had walked in from a blizzard and upended 7 years of careful quiet. It woke when I found you in the den. I don't know what to do with that except to tell you. She absorbed this. That's, she said, and then didn't finish the sentence. She looked at the floor, looked at her hands, looked back at me. I came here because I was traveling through the high pass, and the storm came faster than I expected. I didn't come here because of you. I know. I might not feel it, she said. The way I might not. That's possible, I said. Bonds come in differently for different people. I'm not asking you to feel anything you don't feel. I held her gaze. I'm asking you to stay through the winter and let us both find out. You have patients in my wolf den who need you. I have an outpost infirmary that has been running undersupplied for 2 years. I'm asking you to stay because your work is good, and because my wolf woke up last night, and I am not prepared to pretend that didn't happen. But I am not asking you to do anything about it except exist in the same place for a while. Another long silence. Frost's hip will need another 3 sessions, she said finally, if the weather clears. The weather is not expected to clear for 6 weeks, I said. The smallest thing moved in her expression, not quite a smile, something quieter than a smile and more honest. Then I suppose I have 6 weeks' worth of reasons to stay, she said. She stayed. Not through the winter only, that was what we had agreed and what I had asked, but that became something else, the way things become something else when they are given the right conditions. 6 weeks became 8, became 12. Spring came, and the high pass opened, and she didn't mention leaving. I didn't mention that she hadn't mentioned it. By spring, Frost was walking without favoring the hip. Ash's shoulder had closed clean. Red and Salt moved more freely in the warm mornings. Kern was back on light circuit duty and very proud of himself about it. She had reorganized my infirmary. She had trained my pack hand in 3 techniques he hadn't known. She had won some kind of ongoing card dispute with my elderly packmate in the Great Hall, the terms of which I had never fully understood. She had developed a habit of leaving her day pack on the chair outside the wolf den when she went in, and every wolf in the outpost had learned that the pack on the chair meant she was available, and I had noticed, on multiple occasions, wolves going to sit near that chair when she wasn't there, just sitting near it, waiting. They didn't do that for anyone else. They hadn't done it for anyone in 7 years. My wolf was present every day. That was the part that still surprised me, months in, not the intensity of it, though that was its own thing, but the simple dailiness. 7 years of quiet, and then every morning, awake, present. The bond sense humming steadily, beneath the administrative machinery of the day. She had not said she felt it. She had also not left. The day she told me was a late afternoon in early summer, and we were in the wolf den, and it was not ceremonial in any way. She was rebandaging Salt's front leg, a minor sprain from an unexpected step, and I was sitting on the pen rail watching because I had no particular reason to be elsewhere, and because I liked being where she was, which I had stopped pretending was for administrative reasons. Salt was being stoic and slightly long-suffering, the way he always was when he required medical attention, and she was talking to him the way she talked to all of them, quietly, steadily, explaining what she was doing and why, as though he understood, which I had come to believe all of them did, in their way. Myra, she said to herself, which was odd because that was her own name. I looked at her. She was not looking at Salt. She was looking at her wrist. The mark on her wrist, I hadn't known it was there. I hadn't been looking for it. It wasn't where mine was, and it wasn't the same shape, and it was still coming in, still settling, the way a mark does when the bond is still finding its final form. But it was there. It was warm. I could see it from where I sat. She looked up and found me looking. 3 weeks ago, she said, I thought it was a mark from a compound that didn't agree with my skin. Then I thought it might be. She stopped. I tested 3 other explanations before I admitted to myself what it was. 4, I guessed. 5, she said. I'm very thorough. Salt made a noise of moderate complaint about the bandaging process. She went back to finishing it, her hands steady, her expression doing the thing it did when she was processing something internally and not ready to talk about it further. I had learned her well enough to know when to wait. When Salt was done, she sat back against the pen wall and looked at the mark on her wrist for a long moment. I didn't come here looking for this, she said. I want to be clear about that. I know, I said. You've been clear about it from the beginning. It doesn't change that. She looked at me. I was testing other explanations because I didn't want it to be this. Not because of you, because of what it would mean, about where I would be, what I would stop being allowed to be. I got down off the pen rail and sat in the straw instead, which put me at her level, which felt right. What would you stop being allowed to be? I said. Someone who goes where she's needed, she said. That's what I do. That's what I've done for 11 years. I go where the work is, and then I go where the next work is. She looked at her wrist again. I don't know how to do that and also be this. You reorganized my infirmary, I said. You trained Petter in 3 new techniques. You have standing patients who will not let anyone else handle their assessments. You are, by every measure I have, already doing your work here. That's not. She stopped. I'm not asking you to stop going where you're needed, I said. I'm not asking you to be anything different than what you are. My kingdom is large and my outpost infrastructure is poorly served by the current healer rotation, and I have one very senior wolf with hip issues who will be miserable when you leave. I let that sit for a moment. I am asking you to consider that the place where you're needed and the place where you are might be the same place. She was quiet for a long time. Salt had decided that now that his bandage was done, he would lay his head in her lap, which he did, and she put her hand on his neck without looking down, automatic and gentle. 7 years, she said finally. You said your wolf had been dormant for 7 years. Yes. That's a long time to carry something that heavy, she said. She said it the same way she said everything as a fact, but a fact that mattered. It was, I said. She looked at me with the particular focus she used when she was assessing a patient. Not clinical, exactly, but very present, very clear, as though she was looking at the actual situation and not the one she'd expected to find. Then she looked at her wrist, then at mine. You were nailing, she said, in the den when you found me. I hadn't told her that. Yes. You were kneeling in the straw in the middle of the night next to an unconscious woman you'd spoken to twice. She paused. And you sent for blankets instead of waking me. You needed sleep more than you needed a conversation, I said. She looked at me for a long time. All right, she said, not like a capitulation, like a woman who has run all 5 of her alternative explanations and arrived, finally, at the one that fits. All right. The bond finished settling over the following weeks. That is how it goes. The mark comes in fully, and the bond sense resolves from something uncertain into something as plain and constant as a heartbeat. She told me once, standing at the infirmary window watching the summer wolves in the meadow below the outpost, that it felt less like a new thing arriving and more like a door she hadn't known was closed swinging open, and the air on the other side being warmer than she'd expected. I understood that exactly. We held no ceremony. That was by mutual agreement, arrived at over a conversation that lasted less than 10 minutes because we were, by then, people who understood each other fairly well and didn't require long negotiation about things we both already knew. There are formal bonding rights in my kingdom, and they are significant, and we both agreed that we had already passed through something that mattered more. What we did instead, my court came to Varenkosk in the autumn, as they always did for the Northern Accounts Review. My steward, who had been maintaining his neutral expression about all of this for 7 months and deserved an enormous amount of credit for it, handled the introduction with the economy of a man who had been carefully prepared. My counsel had expected vaguely that I might eventually take a mate. I do not think they had expected her to be a traveling healer with a well-used pack and ink-stained hands and an ongoing card dispute with my oldest packmate. They were professionally measured about it, which is what I had trained them to be. Frost was not measured about it. He was present in the hall because she had lobbied successfully for the better recovered wolves to have access to the main hall in good weather, and he sat beside her chair with the proprietary certainty of an animal who has known something important before anyone else did, and who is not modest about having been right. My wolf watched the whole proceeding with deep satisfaction. There is a detail I have told almost no one. On the morning after I found her in the wolf den, before she came to the receiving hall, I went back to the den alone, not for any administrative reason, just to stand there for a few minutes in the pen where she had slept, where the straw still held the shape of where she'd been. The mark on my wrist was warm, the wolves were calm. The winter light was coming in through the high window at the eastern end, the kind of pale gold that means the blizzard is finally breaking. I had not felt anything in that chest in 7 years. Not grief I had managed, catalogued, folded away into the wall with the names, but warmth, the simple animal certainty that something was right. That had been gone since Vorenvast, and I had, somewhere in the 3rd or 4th year, stopped waiting for it to come back. I stood in the wolf den in the early morning and the light came in and my wolf was present and I thought, there she is. That is where she is. That was all, that was enough. She is my healer and my mate, and she still goes where the work is. Only now the circuit is planned, and there is always a door she knows is open, and the room near the wolf den is always kept ready. Frost is old now and slow, and his hip will never be perfect. He sleeps with his head on her feet in the evenings when the cold comes in, and she lets him, and doesn't tell him he's getting straw on the good floor. I was not looking for any of it. I had stopped looking for anything except the next piece of administrative business and the next year's quiet. And then a blizzard came, and a woman with a canvas pack full of medicine and a complete absence of deference to rank walked through my gate and spoke plainly to my wolves and fell asleep in the straw, and 7 years of careful gray came apart in the space of a single night. I don't kneel for ceremony. I knelt for her in the dark before I had any words for what I was doing. I think that was the truest version of it, before the language, before the mark, before I had a category for any of what I was feeling. Just a man kneeling in the straw beside 5 sleeping wolves and a woman he hadn't known the name of 3 days ago, and a warmth in the wrist he had forgotten the shape of, and something in the chest saying, here, this, finally.